أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. Inshallah, the topic is it's an extremely important one, and one I'm sure all of us are looking forward to, inshallah. This webinar, inshallah, will be conducted by our dear brother, Dr. Mashuq Ali, who is a distinguished leader with extensive experience in education, community development, and social cohesion. He has a number of current roles, which includes trustee and chairman of the board of directors for Markfield Institute of Higher Education. He's also the chair of Bordesley Green Girls School and Sixth Form in Birmingham, as well as a member of the Birmingham City Council Schools Forum. He's a member of the Sheikh Zayed Board for Islamic Studies, University of Cambridge, a director of Global Trading Enterprise in Turkey, supporting humanitarian refugee work, executive board member of the Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber, board of directors member for University of Wolverhampton. He has a long distinguished in service, public service, as well as prior to his retirement in 2017 from the Birmingham City Council. He held a number of really important roles, which included cooperative director of equalities, community safety and cohesion, operational lead for social cohesion, strategic board member for youth violence, city council lead for tackling extremism. So there are a whole host of things I can talk about in terms of what Dr. Mashuq has done, but I'm going to leave it there for the time being. This is certainly an important topic for us, looking at our intellectual heritage. And without any further ado, I'll pass you on to Dr. Mashuq, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Riza. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nasalli ala Rasul al-Kareem. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yes, you can.
Yes, we can hear you, yeah.
Brothers and sisters, it's a real pleasure to be with you this evening and to introduce a very important topic, which I'm sure you would all agree is really of vital importance to us in the contemporary Muslim world. Obviously, this is a very vast topic. Consequently, it's going to be in two parts. This first part today is the formative personalities that have evolved the foundations for Muslim intellectual thought or Islamic intellectual thought. And it will take about half an hour presentation, and then it will allow time for others to contribute, because I'd like to see this as a collaborative exercise, as well as any comments and questions anyone may have. So I would like to begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with three well-known quotes from the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that he said to the Malaika, I will create a Khalifa on earth. They said, will you place one who will make mischief therein and shed blood? While we do celebrate your praises and glorify your name, he said, I know what you know not. That's in Al-Baqarah. Then another verse in Al-Baqarah, which is the second verse after this one. He taught Adam the names of all things. Then he presented them to the Malaika and said, tell me the names of these, if what you say is true. And then in another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, read the name of your Lord who created insan from a clot of blood. Read, and your Rabb is the gracious who imparted knowledge by means of the pen. He taught insan, that's humanity, what he did not know. These are just a sample of well-known verses that everybody's familiar with, which demonstrates that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects that our career on earth be underpinned and determined through ilm and hikmah. And there are many verses in the Quran and in the Hadith literature that confirms this. And this ilm and hikmah is by consulting, evaluating, assessing, analyzing, and reasoning to arrive at conclusions, drawing both on the totality of Allah's wahi and the messages of all his prophets. This points to a single source of ilm and hikmah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the power and the only authority, the source of the Tawhidic epistemological framework. It also means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the iman of those who submit to him without thinking, and only through taqlid, imitation. It requires us to really understand what our iman is about, and that requires knowledge, and that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects of us. That's why I do not actually subscribe to the translation of iman to be faith. I prefer the word conviction, because convictions is underpinned by knowledge. The potential to think about the creation and the universe using the sources of wahi, risala, ghaib, akhirah, and the intellect bestowed on all humans is obligatory. It is a fard ain, an act of ibadah. This obligation to contemplate and reflect and seek hikmah is the characteristic that stands out as Adam and subsequently all humans' superiority over Iblis. Fired by this Islamic knowledge, this approach to knowledge, since the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Muslims throughout the ages, in all regions of the world, have made important strides in what we now call Islamic civilization. In fact, ilm and hikmah has been the most powerful determinant of Muslim civilization or Islamic civilization in all its aspects. It can be said that ilm and hikmah are the source of Muslim intellectual history, which has covered and continues to cover the sciences, philosophy, law, ethics, politics, economics, the humanities, etc., as well as the long history of the sciences of theology. Islamic thought can be broadly categorized through the following periods. The classical, that's the time from the Prophet ﷺ up to the 14th centuries. The medieval period, 14th to 18th centuries, and contemporary from the 19th century today. My presentation, as I said earlier, would only cover the early part, the formative years, and highlight some of the leading personalities in that Islamic intellectual heritage. And on another occasion, we'll cover the remaining periods. Before the emergence of the Prophet ﷺ's mission, the most important intellectual movements at the time were China, India, Babylon, Egypt, Persia, and the Greeks. Islam encourages its followers to gain knowledge wherever they find it. Muslim scholars enrich their thought by all treasures of knowledge without any hesitation. The most powerful tradition above all was Greek. Greek thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle caught the interest of Muslim scholars. They wrote a number of books and contemporaries on the thoughts of these Greek thinkers. Here, an important point to note is that every Muslim scholar only accepts those ideas and thoughts which would be according to the basic spirit of the Quran and Sunnah. However, in this way, Muslim thinkers captured all previous thoughts and ideas and contributed to the advancement of knowledge through their own creative ideas, which played a vital role in the development of culture and civilization of humankind. During the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the source of knowledge was himself, the revelations he received from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his hadith, his life, the seerah. Whilst the Sahaba received Allah's message direct from the Prophet Muhammad, the Sahaba set up study circles in their homes and in the Prophet's masjid in Medina. This practice has continued through the ages up to today. Throughout the Muslim world, Muslim families have study circles at home and in the masajids. Some of us, nearly all of us, may have been members of those circles. These circles, led by the Sahaba in the early days, were based on the oral tradition. Although some of the members of those circles would take notes on whatever parchment they had available. However, this oral tradition resulted in a change of narrators, what we call isnad, but this should not be confused with the isnad of the hadith, and it relied heavily on memory. Following the death of the Prophet, 4 centers of learning emerged. One in Mecca, led by Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu an, who brought together a group of students who benefited from his intimate knowledge of the Quran, and it can be said that these were the founders of the early exegesis, tafsir of the Quran, because Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu an would give explanations and interpretations of what he saw and what he heard from the Prophet Muhammad. Then there was a circle in Medina. This was of a collegiate form of Sahaba. A group of Sahaba came together, such as Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu an, Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu an, Aisha radiallahu an, Abu Huraira radiallahu an, etc. This school focused on the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, and this is understandable because Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha and Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu an, Abdullah ibn Umar were amongst the leading transmitters of hadith. A school emerged in Kufa, and this was led by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was sent by Khalif Umar radiallahu an to Kufa. From there, Ibn Mas'ud established a Kufan school. It is from this school that one of the scholars, Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, one of his students, Abu Hanifa, emerged and was the founder of what we now know as the Hanafi Madhab. Then there was a school in Basra, and this was founded by a female Sahaba, Nusayba bint al-Harith radiallahu anha. She moved from Medina to Basra and taught there. In addition to her, another leading hadith transmitter, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, also moved to Basra. Notably, they had a group of students amongst them, one of whom was Hasan al-Basri, an outstanding Islamic orator, and maybe it can be said that he was the early pioneer of what we now call tasawwuf. He was an ascetic, and he was very humble, but yet very astute Muslim scholar. Through these various schools, the science of hadith scholarship emerged. In particular, they concentrated on tracing the chain of a narrator of a particular hadith. And this would mean they would have to travel long distances in this search. And this became a science in itself, because remember, the tradition early on was based on what was the spoken word. So it was really important to have accuracy in what was said and who said it. With the codification of the Quran and the Hadith literature, then the sciences of exegesis, tafsir, emerged, and consequently the schools of law, Islamic law. The first legal scholar in Islam was Malik ibn Anas, who compiled the Al-Muwatta. Al-Shafi traveled from Makkah to Medina to join Malik ibn Anas to study under him. From Medina, Al-Shafi moved to Baghdad, and at Baghdad there was also many scholars whom he engaged with, and it could be said that he is obviously the founder of the Shafi'i madhab. Ahmad ibn Hanbal was born 164 years after the Hijrah. He also studied in Baghdad, and he was born there. He studied under many teachers in his youth, and he had a significant collection of hadith, and he collected them into what we now call the Musnad, al-Musnad. These four scholars, Malik, al-Shafi, Abu Hanifa, Ibn Hanbal, can be considered the founders of the Usul al-Fiqh, Islamic legal theory. And that methodology, their methodology which they developed, continues up until today in how we develop fiqh. The consequence of their work was that many Muslims across the world would adhere to one of these madhabs. And like myself, although I call myself a Hanafi, I follow the Hanafi madhab, it doesn't mean to say I don't also recognize and learn from the other schools of thought. And that's how many scholars have operated over the centuries. As the Muslim Ummah expanded from beyond the early community, the need for greater synthesis of hadith literature became of increasing demand, particularly with the growth of fiqh and Quranic exegesis, tafsir. Importantly, the need for authenticated hadith collections was in great demand. Foremost amongst those collections were those composed by al-Bukhari, many of us are familiar with him, Muslim, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi. These scholars all resided in the Baghdad area and knew of each other, and therefore depended and relied on each other in sharing their works. By the 4th century after the Hijrah, the four madhabs and the legal schools were crystallized. In 360 after the Hijrah, the first Islamic university came into being, Al-Azhar. And this school, which was actually created by the Fatimids, but who were Shia, was actually converted to Sunni tradition by Salahuddin Ayyubi, has become one of the leading intellectual centers of the Muslim world, and alhamdulillah, it still exists today. As Muslim scholarship flourished from these new beginnings of Islamic civilization, the rapid expansion of its borders resulted in Muslims becoming in contact with other cultures, faiths, and civilizations. These encounters enabled Muslims and their scholars to know more about what we call today philosophy and analytic reasoning. This captured the imagination of Muslim scholars, and they studied it very closely to identify how they best can use it within Islamic thinking. Muslim scholars went so far as to master Greek philosophy and tried to integrate it with the theocentric worldview of Islam. In fact, some Muslim scholars learned Greek, learned Latin, and in many cases, Muslim scholars, because of their engagement with the Jewish community, particularly in places like Spain, acquired the language of Hebrew. This brings us to Al-Kindi, who died in 252 after the Hijrah. He is a key figure in Baghdad for overseeing the translation of Greek works into Arabic. These translations became standard philosophical texts for centuries to come. Al-Kindi believed that it is possible to make compatibility between theology and philosophy. And this became an ongoing debate throughout the Muslim world and has played an important part in the development of Muslim intellectual thinking. In the spirit of Al-Kindi was Al-Farabi. He was credited as the first Muslim who presented philosophy as a coherent system in the Islamic world and is considered to be the founder of Islamic philosophy. And he also was very capable in terms of musicology and Muslim music theory. He was a polymath with extensive knowledge in psychology, epistemology, political theory, ethics, astronomy, mathematics, and physics. Ibn Sina was another important contributor to the Islamic intellectual heritage. He was trained in Islamic sciences from an early age. He's considered to be the father of early modern medicine. His most famous works is the Book of Healing, an encyclopedic work. But he wrote also on astronomy, alchemy, geography, psychology, mathematics, and physics. In the 5th century after the Hijrah, we witnessed the rise of Al-Ghazali. He is commonly known as a Mujaddid, revivalist. Whilst not rejecting philosophy, he felt Muslim philosophers had gone too far and compromised on some of the fundamental concepts of Islam. His works were highly acclaimed by his contemporaries, and he was awarded the honorific title Proof of Islam, Hujjatul Islam. Two major works are the basis of his rebuttal of philosophy of his time. Ihya Ulum ad-Din, the revival of religious sciences, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. He continues to be a guiding light amongst Muslims, particularly because in many of his writings, ethics was an important part of what underpinned his thinking, akhlaq. And consequently, throughout Muslim scholarship, he's drawn on by many Muslim scholars, even today. In the 8th century onwards, we see the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans embraced the Hanafi madhab, and also they acquired Sufi beliefs and practices which were woven into the very fabric of the Ottoman life. And those who have been to Turkey today will witness that tradition still continues. Scholarly engagement flourished through Arabic as a facilitating language throughout the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a very important point I'd like to make, that Arabic became the lingua franca amongst Muslim scholars and even amongst Muslims. So a Muslim can travel from Spain to any part of the Muslim world and be understood, because Arabic became the basic language despite the existence of ethnic languages. It's a pity that today we have lost that treasure, which maybe we need to think about in terms of our future. This became an enabler. This use of Arabic became an enabler for the ulama discourse, because it meant that increasingly they can exchange ideas irrespective from what part of the Muslim world or the Ottoman Empire they came. Important within the empire was the increasing contribution made by Muslim women who were involved in Islamic scholarship. Of those I would like to mention would be al-Khair Ahmad al-Khaliq and al-Hana bint Muhammad al-Misriya. They were both well-known Hadith scholars, and they had their circles, both men and women, and would exchange their interpretations of many Hadith and Quranic verses. I'd also like to mention Asma bint Kamal ad-Din, who was renowned in the Quran, Hadith, and in fiqh. And there were many, many more. The Ottoman Empire seemed to have inspired an increasing number of Muslim women into scholarship. In the early Muslim community, Muslim women played a really important role. They were the main transmitters of Hadith. But over time, their role and their influence waned. But through the Ottoman Empire, there was a kind of resurrection of their importance in transferring knowledge to others. By this time, Muslims had advanced into southern Europe, which brings us to the well-known Ibn Rushd. He was an Andalusian polymath and jurist. In medicine, he proposed a new theory for stroke. He described the signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease. He was a scholar of Greek philosophy. He wrote many commentaries on Aristotle, and by so doing introduced Greek work into the non-Muslim Western or European world. In the 14th century, Muslim travel across the globe was at its height. At this time, I would like to mention a very extraordinary personality. Many of you may have heard of him, Ibn Battuta. He was a Maghribi Muslim scholar, explorer, and traveler, and over a period of 30 years visited much of Africa, Middle East, and the Iberian Peninsula. His work, known in translation, is a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. This pioneer piece of work reflected his expertise in anthropology, sociology, and historiography. There is no doubt that this formative period of intellectual thinking gave birth to a new civilization, the Islamic. And because of Muslim expansion, this period also enabled the kickstart of the European Renaissance and Reformation, because most of the Muslim world were able to convey to them and transfer to them much of the knowledge which they had acquired. Unfortunately, the impact of European imperialism, internal conflicts in the Muslim world, we find that we were unable to sustain this intellectual leadership. This gave rise to a number of revivalist movements, particularly in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Hopefully, in our next session, we will be able to touch upon some of the leading lights of that period. Jazakallah khairan, shukran.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Mashuq, for that presentation. I think there's a lot for us to reflect upon what was said. What we'll do, inshallah, is that the floor is open now for you to make comments or to ask questions, inshallah. If anybody wants to do so, then let me know and then we can start, inshallah.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum
Assalamu
assalam.
alaikum, Dr. Mashuq. Sanwar Qara here. How are you?
Oh, assalamu alaikum, akhi. How are you keeping? All right?
Alhamdulillah, fine. Yeah, I didn't see you approaching Baitul Hikmah in Baghdad.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes. And that became a very powerful institution.
If you can just situate it in the time of the history line.
Yeah, at that, as the Sahaba and their successors evolved these circles and schools, it became important in the time of the Muslim period to establish what we call Baitul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And as a consequence of that, a whole host of new scholarship emerged. And I think this is one of the precursors to the Al-Azhar University, in a way. If you want to add anything, please do so, brother.
No.
Knowledgeable.
No, I just learned a little bit about that, but I really appreciate the timeline and the insight of your program, inshallah.
Dr. Mashuq, you highlighted the Quranic emphasis on ilm, knowledge, and hikmah.
Yes.
How did early Muslim scholars reconcile divine revelation with human reasoning in developing Islamic epistemology?
Actually, this became a tension because there were those scholars who didn't wish to, as far as they were concerned, vast majority of the early Muslim community, Allah was the ultimate source of all knowledge. And the Prophet Muhammad Sallam was the exemplar and practitioner of that knowledge, and therefore he became the second source. Obviously, experiential knowledge, and because of the expansion of the community, began to bring in reason as another source of knowledge. And this was the beginning of a tension between the early Muslims and subsequent Muslim scholars began to draw upon their acquisition of Greek and Hellenistic thinking, which was based on reason, and to kind of square it with the framework of Islamic knowledge that the early Muslims wished. So reason provided a kind of critical thinking, not in terms of the Quran and Hadith. The critical thinking in relation to the Hadith was more to do with ensuring that the Hadith literature was authentic. That was important, and therefore scrutinizing what was being said, who said it became important. In terms of the Quran, reason became important to understand the wahi, the revelation, but not in any way to be equal to that source of knowledge. Therefore, reason was used as a tool to actually draw understanding of the sources of the Quran and Sunnah. And that
Okay.
and Muslims,
Okay.
sorry if I can, Muslims didn't see that in conflict because that's where the human creativity came in to be able to because they were being inspired by the Quran to use knowledge in the best possible way. Now, ethics is a very important aspect of the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. So consequently, scholars had to constantly refer to the ethics as revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and practiced by the Prophet Muhammad to make sure they were not deviating from what was to be truly understood.
Asim Abdullah here. I have a question on a comment that you made early on, that you think that you prefer the translation of Iman as conviction instead of faith, right? Would you say that the process that the Prophet Ibrahim, alayhi salam, the process that he went through in coming to the conclusion that Allah was his Rabb, as described in the Quran, that this is evidence of Iman as conviction? And is this an example of critical thinking being exhibited by him?
Of course, and I think throughout all the prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, he didn't expect them to blind follow him. They expected, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects us to think, to use our fikr to understand why he's asking us to do what he's asking us to do. And that example that you've given of Hazrat Ibrahim on that particular very important occasion when he was asked to do something, critical thinking came into it, and he came to a conclusion that he had to do this act. And I believe critical thinking is an important part of Islamic epistemology. If I can give another example, if you look at the methodology of the Sharia, so you have the Quran and Sunnah as the sources, then you have Qiyas and
Ijma.
Ijtihad and Ijma. All of those lead us to conclusion that we are allowed to think to enable us to advance in tune with human advancement. And that's what makes Islam and the Quran and the Sunnah live and living.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Assalamu
Dr.
alaikum,
Mashuq.
Jazakallah
Alaikum assalam.
for the very excellent presentation, full of very important facts. And I think at one point you said the Turkish Ottoman contribution, or Ottoman came to this field of intellectual endeavor in 8th century. I was a bit confused there. And secondly, you also mentioned that in the early days of Islam, women were not much behind men in terms of intellectual pursuits and activity in arena, and then that dissipated. But then you said that during Ottoman period, beginning of the Ottoman period, women started to play their role again. Would you have any idea what led to that revival of women participation?
Yeah, I think the way in which the Ottomans structured the Ottomans structured their empire was quite imaginative, in that they, in adhering to the Sharia principles, whether you were a Muslim or outside of the Muslim theological map, they were able to inspire people to adjust to an Islamic framework which allowed that thinking to occur, whether it was, and it was basically gender neutral. And I think that allowed for that rebirth of the contribution of Muslim women in the empire. In addition to the fact that I think even if you see Turkey today, the role of women is very different in certain other parts of the Muslim world. And I think that the increasing number of Muslim scholars, female scholars, was required if the empire was to sustain itself, particularly in areas of family relations and building communities and villages, etc. So I think that the way they structured the empire, which is quite unique and does require some depth in study, I think helped the revival of Muslim female scholars. As you know, they followed the system whereby each community had its own leader and had its own structure, and they allowed that to flourish as well. And I think that helped considerably in enhancing the role of women scholars within the empire. When I talked about the 8th century, I'm talking about the emergence of the Ottoman Empire was beginning. It wasn't taking place, but there was a movement towards that.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. My second question is that you do not touch upon, or maybe need another program on the thought of deviation. For one is the Hajri, and the other one is the, what is it called? Yeah, the Imam Ghazali's point of view of reforming what was already going on among the the theory of al-haq and all this deviation of this. So maybe need another program. I would like you. I would like you maybe either short answers or take it another occasion where these thought like Hajri and today the Quraniyun, all these different thought, and where do we stand? Where does Islam stand on that?
Yeah, the next session will pick up the trends that has emerged throughout Islamic intellectual history.
Okay.
We're just highlighting the personalities and the formative period.
Thank you.
And that, as some of us are well aware, because of those issues, in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and particularly with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Caliphate, revivalist movements arose to actually pick up from where maybe Al-Ghazali left off. And I think that those are very interesting periods. But during the intellectual history, there are some contentious issues which we have to deal with. But I don't think we could have covered all of that with justice in this session.
I think, Dr. Mashuq, you mentioned the Quranic emphasis. The Quran encourages seeking knowledge from all sources. And then you talked about the Muslims indeed learned different languages, including Hebrew, as well as Greek philosophy. How did Muslim scholars ensure that foreign ideas aligned with their sort of Tawhidic framework without compromising Islamic principles?
The point that Brother, was it Anwar Kara who just spoke?
Yeah.
That Brother Anwar Kara has just mentioned has been the continuing tension in that obviously Muslim engagement with other forms of thinking has been challenging. And there have been Muslim scholastic groups who spent a lot of time on these debates. And I think that it's those consequently, certain trends have emerged out of that. But I think that's been a continuous tension amongst Muslim scholars from the time they were able to engage with other forms of intellectual thinking, where reason, Hellenistic thinking predominantly became a challenge for them in relation to how they can be authentic to the Tawhidic principle. As it is today, I mean, the unfortunate situation is where we are the other way around. Whereas we were leaders in the thinking of those days, and therefore we were in a position of power. That's not the case here. And so we have all these trends that we're thinking about of Islamization of knowledge and all this kind of thing, which is really important for us to look at, because it's a kind of different range of knowledge challenges that we are facing today compared with the early Muslims and the Muslims in the Middle Ages.
Anybody has any other questions you would like to ask? Dr. Mashuq, you also talked about the role that women like Nusayba and Asma bint Kamaluddin played, as very prominent scholars. And often what we find is that the contribution to a lot of these women are sort of underrepresented in a lot of our history. Why do you think this is the case? And that there is a sense of underrepresentation of the role of women over the centuries?
I think outside of the Arab and Ottoman world, I think the cultures of certain obviously, the Muslim world is now a commonwealth of communities, commonwealth of ethnic groups. And there are certain parts of the commonwealth where, unfortunately, Muslim women generally didn't have much of a status anyway. And Islam kind of liberated women because it has some very high standards of women's rights. And it's taken time for those parts of the Commonwealth of the Muslim world to be able to accept and also to move towards greater equalities for women. And I think that's been a contribution. And much of this, if I may say, is to do with Muslim communities or the Ummah from the Far East.
You mentioned in your presentation the 4 early centers of learning, Makkah, Medina, Kufa, and Basra, and the pivotal roles that they played in Islamic scholarship. Can you give us a sense of what were the differences in the methodologies that these centers played, and what impact did they have on Islamic intellectual tradition?
Because they were invariably led by the Sahaba, the methodologies weren't very different. It just happens to be the location, the geographic location where they were. But in fact, the methodology of thinking and the processes and tools which they use weren't very, very different amongst them. Because remember, these were people who originated from Makkah and Medina. The Makkah school and the Medina school obviously would be very, very close to each other. But then those who branched off to Basra and Baghdad, etc., the Sahaba, because they were carrying the same thinking, I don't think their methodology and approach to intellectual analysis would be very different. And these kinds of movements, by the way, is not unique. I mean, we see it even amongst us. I would like to think that in Mihi, those who graduate from Mihi, they become our alumni, actually a part of a movement of of similar thinking, and they would branch out. And what they learned and the experience, the Markfield experience, which they have, would actually impact on them throughout their life. We see this in other parts in the non-Muslim world, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Princeton. They're all movements, intellectual movements, and you'll find that the scholars and the students who emerge from those places continue on the same culture. So I don't expect that the early Muslim community, those who had the direct experience of the life of Muhammad Sallam, would diverge very far, irrespective as to where they eventually did their teaching.
Okay, inshallah. Does anybody have any other questions you would like to ask? When we look back at our history, one of the things that we note among a lot of our scholars is the breadth of knowledge which they had and the amount of different fields that they entered into. How do you think we can recapture, or is it important to recapture some of that, in terms of search for not just becoming super specialized in one or two areas as we do now, but to be able to have a breadth of understanding of other fields as well?
I think it's going to be very difficult to capture that because we must remember in those days there wasn't a distinct. What we have today is this distinction between what we call religious knowledge and secular knowledge. That thinking didn't exist in those. And for us to recapture that is going to be very difficult. In addition to the fact that knowledge is so vast now, and each subject area is quite complex, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to have a range of individuals that is expertise in 5 or 6 subject areas. What we can do, and I think this is where, again, we benefit from the early Muslim community and the formative, is that there is a set of methodology which was laid down. And today, in our academia, you'll find that methodology, the importance of methodology and transferable skills become important, and you can use those skills in any subject area. But I think for anyone to have an in-depth knowledge of medicine as well as an in-depth in musicology is going to be extremely difficult in the world in which we live today. What is important for us is how do we benchmark what we learn against the Quran and Sunnah and the Sharia. Unfortunately, we don't do that sufficiently enough. It's all left to the individual. So the benchmarking against the Sharia, I think, is something we need to resurrect much more in our community than we do today.
You just mentioned this divide of the religious, and the secular, and you said that this is something which didn't exist in the beginning, but it has become sort of commonplace now. When did this thinking emerge? Is this part of our colonial experience, or is it something before? And how do we? And it seemed to be well embedded in our communities, Muslim communities. How can we address this problem? Because it leads to a whole host of other issues.
Okay, I think we have fallen into a trap, I think, particularly because of our sloppiness of the use of language. Firstly, we need to go back as to what is Islam. Islam is not a religion as understood in the West. Islam is a deen. We don't use this concept sufficiently enough. It is a way of life. Therefore, in our way of life, we don't compartmentalize what we do on a daily basis into this religious and secular. So we need to go back a little bit in terms of how we understand our own concepts. Therefore, in the early time of the Muslim community, and even up until the Ottoman period, there wasn't this distinction between what we call religious, in inverted commas, and secular. This is an imposition placed upon us because of the intellectual dynamics and confrontations that have happened in the West. And because we have been colonized, they have imposed that upon us. Because within Europe, the role of religion was constantly being challenged. Their Christianity was constantly being challenged, to be frank. And they actually imparted this challenge in our own societies, and we therefore began to absorb it. In addition to the fact that intellectually, the intellectual dynamism that we had in the early period kind of waned because of this imperial exploitation, but also we had our own internal problems, internal conflicts within the Commonwealth of Muslim Communities.
Any other questions from anyone else?
Okay. Yes, I have one question, and that has to do with the role. What do you think is or is it important for us to consider the Arabic language, as a necessary form of knowledge or form of communication, and as part of this intellectual revival at this time? Because there's some thinking that it's not necessary to really learn Arabic language, for our, continued development. What do you think?
I think it's actually a big loss that we haven't continued Arabic as the lingua franca of the Muslim Ummah. It is really important because I'm constantly, daily thinking about the use of words in another language other than Arabic and what it means. And I come up all the time with the fact that, we haven't really been able to express ourselves properly in, say, the English or French languages. Whereas if we spoke Arabic, and I'm talking about not colloquial Arabic, classical Arabic, I think we would understand each other better because we really understand what is the essence of the meaning of the word. And I think that's important. And so I do believe that part of our revival should be the Arabic language, and it has nothing to do with our relationship with the Arab world. It has to do with, it happens to be the case that the Quran and Islamic sources are in Arabic, and a lot of the exegesis and in the Arabic language. And unless we grapple with this, we'll be losing an important source of knowledge.
No, just a quick follow-up question. I know we need to finish. So, a natural question that follows this is then, how do we promote the teaching and the learning of the classical Arabic in the West? And because most of the Arab world, they speak colloquial Arabic. They don't speak, classical Arabic. And the people, think then, well, classical Arabic is not, really important, for us.
Well, my little knowledge of how Arabic has since evolved is that actually classical Arabic still remains debate. And the various colloquialisms are subject to geographic reasons, but the differences are not that great, not that considerable. I mean, there are two examples I'd like to give of a personal nature that I've been involved in. So in the 1960s and 70s in Britain, we had what we called a mother tongue program in schools, where government put funding for the teaching of new immigrants their mother tongue. And I fought for the fact that, for me, that was not important. For the Muslim community and for young Muslims, what I felt was important was the teaching of Arabic, which they were willing to support, by the way. It's just that because of our own ethnic hang-ups and our lack of recognition of how important Arabic is, it didn't happen. Now, in this school, a second example, in the school which I chair, we have 1,100 young women, and they're all Muslims, and it's a maintained school. It's not an academy. So it's a local government school. Arabic is taught in that school, and the take up by the young women is pretty high, very high. In fact, it's more the take up for, we make 3 languages available in addition to European languages. That's Arabic, Bengali, and Urdu. And Urdu and Bengali has the lowest take compared with Arabic. So it is possible, but it's a question of are we willing as a community as a whole to actually push for that?
Well, I think there needs to be my personal feeling. I mean, I share your feeling on on this and I'm of the view that we really need to create a movement to promote the teaching of much more than what is existing in England, to promote the teaching and the learning of the classical Arabic. Our people, like say in the Caribbean, just feel satisfied to just read Arabic, to just read the Quran. And there's a resistance to really learning the language, and I think it really is a huge loss. It's very sad that people are their attitude is like that.
We're a community. It's been proven by research that an individual can learn more than one language. In fact, a lot of people in other parts of the world have 3 or 4 languages which they're familiar with. And it also affects your mindset as well in relation to how you to others. And I think that there are so many benefits, and there's no reason why an individual can't learn English, learn Arabic, and learn their mother tongue. I don't see a problem with that. It's in Britain in particular, they're not very good at this. The wider society is not very good at learning languages, and that's because they believe everybody should be speaking English, whereas in fact that's to do with their imperial past. Whereas in other parts of the world, that's not the case. People do speak more than 2 languages, and there's no reason why that cannot happen. But I do believe, coming back to the point that you're making, Arabic language is essential if we're really to understand Quran from this and the Sunnah from the sources. I found it extremely difficult, and I found it difficult to be able to translate as accurately as I would like it to be in a language, source language of Islam.
Are there any other final comments that anybody would like to make or questions before we close, inshallah? So we've looked today at the early period, formative period of Islam until the 8th century. And inshallah, we'll move on from then until the next period, inshallah, and in the next webinar. Are there some issues or particular points during that period that anybody would like Professor Mashuq to address? If so, if you you can put it into the into the WhatsApp groups, inshallah, and then we can look at some of those areas, inshallah. So with this, we'll bring this webinar to a close. I would like to thank everyone for being part of today's webinar, and I hope, inshallah, and of course, Dr. Mashuq for his presentation, and hopefully, inshallah, we'll see everybody next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam.